Some forests don't stay silent forever. Sometimes they wait for someone willing to listen. The first snow of December drifted through the Ashmorn pines like ash falling from a forgotten fire, soft and endless beneath the pale glow of the moon. Deep in the northern woods of Montana, where the roads narrowed into winding trails and the nearest town sat nearly 40 miles away, a single cabin stood alone beside a frozen creek. Its porch light burned faintly against the dark, trembling each time the wind moved through the trees. Inside, Cole Mercer sat near the fireplace with a wool blanket across his knees and a half-finished cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The fire cracked softly, filling the room with the scent of cedar smoke and old pine wood, but the warmth never quite reached his eyes. At 40 years old, Cole carried himself with the quiet stillness of a man who had spent too many years listening for danger. His broad shoulders still held the shape of military discipline beneath his faded flannel jacket, though time and grief had worn away whatever sharpness once lived there. A streak of silver touched the dark hair above his temples, and the deep lines near his gray-blue eyes looked carved there by winters harsher than this one. Across the room, Ranger stood motionless by the front window. The German shepherd had been staring into the forest for nearly 20 minutes without moving so much as a paw. His silver and cream coat shimmered in the firelight while his ears remained high and fixed toward the woods beyond the frozen creek. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched. Cole glanced up from the old book resting unopened in his lap. "You gonna tell me what's out there, boy?" he asked quietly. Ranger did not respond. Outside, the wind drifted low through the trees with a sound almost like distant whispering. The forest behind the cabin stretched for miles untouched, dense with black spruce and towering pines so old their branches blocked most of the moonlight. Locals in the nearest town rarely came near Ashmorn Ridge after dark. Some blamed the weather. Others blamed old stories. Cole had never cared much for stories. War had taught him that reality was usually worse. Ranger suddenly tilted his head slightly to the left. Exactly 27 seconds later, he did it again. Cole frowned. The dog had been repeating the same strange motion every night for the past week, always facing the same section of forest beyond the creek. At first, Cole assumed it was an animal. A deer maybe. A wolf. But tonight felt different. The silence outside carried a weight that pressed against the cabin windows like something alive. The fire behind him gave a sharp pop. Ranger flinched, but never looked away from the trees. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped closer to the glass. His breath fogged the window in pale circles. Cole leaned forward. "Ranger." The dog let out a low whine deep in his throat. Not fear. Recognition. That was the sound that unsettled him most. Ranger had served beside him overseas during search and rescue operations, trained to detect movement beneath collapsed buildings and hidden dangers buried underground. The shepherd trusted instincts more than sight, and more than once those instincts had saved lives. Cole set the coffee aside and rose from his chair. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he walked toward the window. Outside, snow drifted lazily between the trees, silver beneath the moonlight. For a moment, he saw nothing except darkness and falling snow. Then Ranger stiffened beside him. One paw slowly lifted from the floor. Cole narrowed his eyes toward the tree line across the creek. At first it looked like another shadow among the pines. Tall, thin, motionless. But then the figure moved slightly, just enough for moonlight to touch what looked unmistakably like the glow of a lantern hanging at its side. Cole's breath caught in his chest. The nearest house was over 20 miles away. The old logging road had been buried by snow 2 days ago. No one should have been standing out there in weather that had already dropped below zero. Yet the figure remained between the trees, silent and still, as if it had been waiting for them to notice it. The figure remained there for only a few seconds before the lantern light drifted backward into the trees and disappeared completely behind the falling snow. Cole stood frozen beside the window, staring into the darkness long after the glow had vanished. Ranger let out another low whine and stepped back from the glass, pacing once across the cabin floor before returning to the same spot again. The fire crackled softly behind them, but the warmth in the room suddenly felt distant, as though the cold outside had found its way through the walls. Cole rubbed a hand across his jaw and glanced toward the old army watch resting beside the coffee cup on the table. 3:14 in the morning. The storm had already buried most of the logging trails north of the ridge. No sane person would be wandering those woods carrying a lantern in weather like this. Yet something about the figure had not felt threatening. It had felt patient. That unsettled him even more. He pulled the curtain shut and stepped away from the window. Probably some old trapper lost in the snow, he muttered quietly, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Ranger stopped pacing immediately and looked at him with those sharp amber eyes that always seemed to know when he was lying to himself. Cole exhaled slowly and crouched beside the dog, running a hand through the thick fur around his neck. "We are not chasing ghosts tonight." Ranger leaned into his palm for a moment, but his ears stayed fixed toward the forest wall outside. The dog had not relaxed once all week. Neither had Cole, if he was being honest. Sleep had become difficult since moving into the cabin nearly 2 months earlier. Ashmorn Ridge was supposed to be temporary, just a cheap place far enough from people and memories to let his mind settle after years of carrying things he could not fix. But silence had a strange way of making old thoughts louder, especially at night, especially in winter. Cole stood and tossed another split log into the fireplace. Sparks rose in a swirl of orange light before fading up the chimney. The cabin itself was older than he first realized when he bought it. Built sometime in the late 1950s by a retired forest ranger according to the realtor in town. Most people avoided the property because of the isolation and the stories attached to the ridge. Missing hikers, strange lights in the trees, radios losing signal near the creek. Cole had ignored all of it. Every small town in America carried old stories like scars. But now, standing in the dim firelight with Ranger watching the woods like something alive stood out there waiting, the stories no longer felt harmless. The wind outside shifted direction suddenly, rattling the porch rails. Somewhere deep in the forest came the faint metallic sound of chimes moving together. Cole frowned. There were no cabins nearby, no wind chimes hanging anywhere on the property. Ranger's head snapped toward the sound instantly. One sharp breath escaped his nose. Then silence returned. Thick, heavy, listening. Cole walked slowly toward the kitchen sink and looked out the smaller back window facing the creek. Snow drifted across the frozen water in pale ribbons beneath the moonlight. The trees beyond stood black and endless against the mountain slope. For a moment, he thought he saw movement again between the trunks. Not the lantern this time. A shape, tall and narrow, watching the cabin from the opposite side of the creek. Cole blinked once, and the shape vanished. His pulse tightened. Ranger moved beside him silently and pressed close against his leg. The shepherd's fur along his shoulders had risen slightly. Then came the sound. 3 soft knocks. Not on the front door. Not on the walls. From somewhere beneath the cabin floor. The sound came again beneath the floorboards. 3 slow knocks spaced evenly apart, soft enough to make Cole wonder if exhaustion was beginning to twist his mind. Ranger did not seem uncertain. The German shepherd stepped backward from the kitchen window and moved toward the center of the cabin with deliberate caution, nose lowered toward the wooden planks. His claws clicked softly against the floor as he followed the sound across the room toward the old stone fireplace. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than before, as if the darkness outside had begun pressing inward through the walls. Cole grabbed the lantern hanging beside the door and lit it with trembling fingers. Warm amber light spilled across the room, stretching long shadows over the pine walls and exposed beams overhead. Ranger stopped near the fireplace rug and stared downward. His ears stood rigid. Another knock echoed beneath them, this time louder. Cole felt it through the soles of his boots. A faint vibration traveling up through the old wood. He swallowed slowly and crouched beside the dog. "All right," he whispered. "What are you trying to show me?" Ranger pawed once at the edge of the rug. Not frantically. Carefully. Almost respectfully. Cole pulled the heavy woven rug aside inch by inch, revealing the original pine floor underneath. Most of the boards looked worn smooth with age except for one narrow section near the hearth that carried a slightly different shade than the rest. Newer wood. His pulse tightened. He set the lantern down and ran his fingers along the edges of the board. Cold air brushed faintly against his skin from below. Ranger gave another low whine and stepped back toward the wall. Cole stood slowly and fetched the flathead screwdriver from his toolbox near the kitchen counter. Outside, the wind moved harder through the trees now, dragging snow against the cabin windows in long whispering sweeps. Somewhere deep in the forest, the strange metallic chime rang again, faint and distant like a bell carried through fog. Cole slid the screwdriver beneath the edge of the loose board and pulled upward. The plank groaned softly before lifting free. Dust drifted into the lantern light. Beneath the floor sat a narrow metal ring attached to a square wooden hatch no wider than 3 feet across. Cole stared at it in silence. The cabin had no basement according to the property records. No crawl space either. Just stone foundation over frozen ground. Yet here was a hidden hatch buried beneath the fireplace floor. Ranger backed farther away now, amber eyes fixed on the opening as though he remembered something Cole did not. Another 3 knocks rose from below the hatch. Slower this time. Cole's throat tightened. "Hello," he called quietly before realizing how absurd it sounded. No answer came. Only silence thick enough to hear the fire crackling behind him. He hesitated for several seconds before finally gripping the metal ring. The wood felt ice-cold beneath his hand. Slowly he pulled upward. The hatch opened with a long creak, releasing a breath of frozen air that smelled faintly of cedar, earth, and something older he could not name. Ranger immediately lowered himself close to the floor, ears flat now, watching the darkness below with complete focus. Cole lifted the lantern higher and peered inside. A narrow staircase descended beneath the cabin into darkness untouched by light. The steps looked ancient, carved from rough stone instead of wood, disappearing deep below the foundation. Snow continued falling outside while the firelight flickered behind him, but none of that unsettled Cole as much as the realization settling quietly into his chest. Someone had built this place to hide something. Then, from somewhere far below the staircase, came the faint glow of warm yellow light. The yellow light below the staircase flickered softly against the stone walls like the glow of an old lantern moving somewhere far underground. Cole stood motionless beside the open hatch while cold air drifted upward around him in slow waves. Ranger remained near the fireplace, tense and watchful, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness beneath the cabin. Snow hissed gently against the windows outside, but down below there was no wind at all. Only silence, deep and waiting. Cole picked up the lantern with one hand and reached for the flashlight hanging beside the kitchen door with the other. The beam cut sharply across the opening, revealing narrow stone steps descending farther than he expected. The staircase curved slightly as it disappeared underground, the walls damp with age and threaded with roots that pushed through the cracks like veins beneath skin. "Stay close," he whispered. Ranger hesitated for only a second before moving beside him. Together they stepped onto the staircase. The wooden hatch creaked softly overhead as Cole lowered it halfway behind them, leaving only a faint strip of firelight from the cabin above. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. Each step echoed faintly through the narrow passage, while droplets of water tapped somewhere unseen in the darkness below. The smell reminded Cole of old churches and forgotten storm shelters. Earth, stone, dust. Time itself seemed slower underground. Ranger moved carefully ahead of him, muscles tight beneath his thick fur. Twice the dog stopped to listen toward the walls before continuing downward. Cole noticed the shepherd was counting something again. Every 27 seconds his ears twitched sharply toward the same direction, as though a distant sound kept returning beneath the mountain itself. The staircase finally opened into a narrow chamber carved directly into the rock beneath the cabin foundation. Cole lifted the lantern higher and felt his breath catch quietly in his chest. The room was far larger than it should have been. Shelves lined the stone walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with old books, oil lanterns, weathered maps, and dozens of glass jars filled with dried herbs and pine needles long turned gray with age. A heavy wooden table sat near the center of the room beside a rusted cast iron stove. Dust covered nearly everything except for one thing: the lantern burning near the far wall. Its flame moved gently inside the glass as though someone had lit it only moments earlier. Cole approached slowly, boots scraping softly across the stone floor. Ranger stayed behind him now, unusually quiet. Near the lantern sat an old journal bound in cracked brown leather. Beside it rested a porcelain mug still holding steam faint enough to vanish the moment Cole leaned closer. He froze. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Ranger suddenly growled low in his throat and turned toward the rear wall of the chamber. Cole followed his gaze. At first the stone looked solid except for shadows cast by the lantern light. Then he noticed the shape of a narrow wooden door nearly hidden within the rock itself. Thin lines of pale light slipped through the edges. Cole felt the air shift again. Not cold this time. Warm, like heat from another room beyond the wall. Before he could move closer, a soft sound drifted through the door. Music, faint and distant. The crackling melody of an old hymn playing somewhere beyond the stone chamber. Ranger stepped backward slowly until his shoulder touched Cole's leg. The dog's eyes never left the hidden door. Then came the voice. Old, gentle, almost sorrowful. I wondered how much longer the forest would wait before bringing someone down here. The voice carried through the hidden door with the calm steadiness of someone who had not spoken to another human being in a very long time. Cole felt Ranger press closer against his leg as the old hymn continued softly somewhere beyond the wall, its melody trembling faintly like candlelight in the dark. The room beneath the cabin seemed to breathe around them. Warm lantern glow flickered across the stone while shadows shifted gently along the shelves lined with forgotten books and brittle maps. Cole swallowed carefully before stepping toward the narrow wooden door. "Who is there?" he asked. Silence followed for several seconds. Then the old voice answered again. "Someone the mountain forgot to bury." Ranger let out a low rumble deep in his chest, uncertain now rather than afraid. Cole reached for the iron handle and pushed the door open slowly. Warm air drifted into the chamber, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and something faintly sweet, like pine resin burning in an old stove. Beyond the doorway stretched another hidden room carved deep into the mountain itself. The space looked almost impossible beneath the frozen wilderness overhead. Oil lamps glowed softly along the walls beside shelves packed with canned food, hand-carved figurines, weathered journals, and dozens of carefully folded blankets stacked with military precision. A small iron stove crackled gently in the corner beneath a copper kettle, releasing curls of steam into the air. Near the stove sat an elderly man wrapped in a thick wool sweater the color of forest moss. His white beard fell to the center of his chest, and his pale blue eyes reflected the lantern light with startling clarity. He looked less like a stranger than a piece of the mountain itself. Ranger studied him carefully before lowering his head slightly. The old man smiled faintly at the dog. "Smart shepherd," he whispered. "He hears what the forest keeps hidden." Cole remained near the doorway, every instinct still tight with caution. "You have been living down here?" The old man nodded once and slowly closed the weathered book resting in his lap. 47 winters now." Cole stared at him in disbelief. "That is impossible." Most miracles sound impossible at first. The hymn playing softly nearby crackled through an old tabletop radio, sitting beside the stove. Its antenna had been repaired countless times with copper wire and cloth tape. Cole recognized the station immediately. It had not broadcast in Montana for over 30 years. The old man noticed his expression and gave another quiet smile. Signals travel strangely through these mountains. Ranger moved farther into the room now, sniffing the air carefully. The shepherd stopped beside a wooden rocking chair near the far wall and nudged it once with his nose. Hanging above the chair was a faded photograph covered in dust. Cole stepped closer and felt his pulse tighten the moment he saw it. The picture showed 3 young forest rangers standing beside an old lookout tower somewhere deep in Ashmorn Ridge. Snow covered the trees behind them while the men smiled into the camera beneath a pale winter sky. One of them looked painfully familiar. Dark hair, broad shoulders, the same storm gray eyes staring back through time. Cole reached slowly toward the frame. "That is my father." The old man watched him carefully across the room. "Yes," he said softly. "Thomas Mercer built this place with me before the mountain took him." The air inside the hidden chamber seemed to fall still. Even the crackling fire quieted beneath the weight of the words. Cole had spent nearly 20 years believing his father disappeared during a rescue mission somewhere in these forests. No body had ever been found. No explanation ever brought home. Just silence. Endless silence. Ranger sat beside the photograph and looked back toward Cole with those steady amber eyes, as if he had known all along that the forest was never trying to scare them away. It had been trying to lead them home. The old man introduced himself as Walter Grady, though the name stirred no memory in Cole's mind. What lingered instead was the photograph hanging above the rocking chair and the impossible realization that his father had once stood inside this hidden place beneath the mountain. Walter rose slowly from his chair and moved toward the iron stove with the careful balance of someone who had learned to live with silence for company. The room glowed warmly around him, while snow continued falling somewhere far above the stone ceiling. Ranger remained seated near the photograph, calm now, though his ears still twitched every few moments toward sounds Cole could not hear. Walter poured steaming water into 3 chipped mugs resting beside the kettle, then paused with a faint smile. "Forgive me," he said softly. "Habit made me pour one for your father, too." The words settled heavily in the room. Cole stepped closer to the old photograph again, studying the face he had not seen clearly since childhood. Thomas Mercer looked younger there than Cole remembered him. Stronger, too. His expression carried the same quiet steadiness Cole often caught in his own reflection without realizing it. "What happened to him?" Cole finally asked. Walter stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. "The mountain changed one winter. Strange storms. Tremors beneath the ridge. People began disappearing in the woods. Your father believed something was trapped deep beneath Ashmore." Ranger slowly stood and crossed the room toward Walter, resting beside the old man's chair as though listening to every word. Walter reached down carefully and scratched behind the shepherd's ear. "Thomas trusted dogs more than men," he murmured. "Said they listened to the world before speaking back to it." Cole accepted the mug Walter handed him and felt the warmth settle into his frozen hands. The tea smelled faintly of pine and mint gathered from somewhere deep in the forest. "The town said he vanished during a rescue mission," Cole said quietly. Walter nodded once. "That is the story they chose because it frightened people less than the truth." The old radio crackled softly beside the stove. Through the static came faint fragments of weather reports and old hymns drifting between stations long dead. Walter adjusted the antenna slightly before continuing. 47 years ago, there was a church hidden deeper in these woods. Small place, built by logging families during the Depression. One night, the mountain beneath it collapsed after a winter storm. The ground opened. Half the ridge disappeared into the earth. Cole listened silently while the firelight flickered across the stone walls around them. "Your father came with the rescue crews. We searched for survivors for nearly 3 days. Then Ranger Station 12 detected strange vibrations under the snow. Rhythmic, almost alive." Cole's pulse tightened at the familiar word. Vibrations. 27 seconds apart. The same pattern Ranger had been sensing all week. Walter looked toward the dark hallway beyond the hidden room. Thomas believed someone was still trapped beneath the church. Everyone else wanted to seal the ridge and leave. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the hallway and gave one quiet breath through his nose. Walter noticed immediately. "He hears it too," the old man whispered. "The mountain has been waking again." Cole frowned. "What does that mean?" Before Walter could answer, the room trembled faintly beneath their feet. Dust drifted softly from the ceiling beams. The mugs on the table rattled once before falling still again. Ranger stepped backward instantly, eyes fixed toward the far wall where the stone passage disappeared into darkness. Then came the sound. Not knocking this time. Singing. Soft voices echoing somewhere deep beneath the mountain, distant and fragile like a choir buried beneath snow. Cole felt cold spread slowly through his chest despite the fire burning beside him. Walter lowered his eyes toward the floor and whispered almost sadly, "It only happens when the forest remembers." The voices beneath the mountain faded slowly into silence, leaving only the crackling stove and the faint hiss of snow against the earth somewhere high above them. Cole stood motionless near the center of the hidden chamber, while Ranger watched the dark hallway with unwavering focus. The shepherd's ears remained tilted forward, listening to something too distant for human hearing. Walter slowly lowered himself back into the rocking chair beside the stove, the old wood creaking softly beneath his weight. Firelight danced across his weathered face, deepening the lines carved there by decades underground. "You hear them often?" Cole asked quietly. Walter nodded once without lifting his eyes. "Only during certain storms. Only when the ridge begins to wake again." Cole glanced toward the stone passage disappearing into darkness. "What exactly is down there?" The old man took a long breath before answering. "The church." The room seemed colder after he said the word. Walter reached toward a shelf beside the radio and carefully removed a folded map stained dark with age. He spread it across the table beneath the lantern light. The paper showed Ashmorn Ridge as it once looked nearly 50 years earlier. Logging roads, fire watchtowers, ranger stations long erased by storms and time. Near the northern edge of the map, buried deep within the forest, a small symbol marked the location of St. Mercy Chapel. Cole studied the faded ink, while Walter traced one trembling finger along the mountain slope beneath the chapel. The church was built over an older cavern system nobody knew existed, Walter explained softly. When the ridge collapsed during the blizzard, the ground swallowed half the building. Your father believed survivors were trapped beneath the stone. Ranger moved closer to the table now, nose brushing near the marked location on the map. Walter smiled faintly at the dog. Thomas trusted instincts. So does he. Cole leaned closer. Did they ever find the survivors? Walter's silence answered before his words did. The old man slowly shook his head. The rescue teams left after the third day. Supplies ran out. Weather worsened. The state sealed the ridge and called it a recovery site. The fire popped sharply behind them. Walter's pale blue eyes drifted toward the dark hallway again. But your father stayed. Cole felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Why? Walter looked at him carefully. Because he heard singing beneath the snow. The room fell still once more. Ranger let out a soft breath and lowered himself onto the stone floor beside Cole's boots. Walter continued in almost a whisper now, as though afraid the mountain itself might overhear. Thomas said the voices were not frightening. He believed they were guiding him toward survivors trapped below the chapel ruins. Cole remembered the strange choir echoing through the stone only minutes earlier and felt cold move slowly through his arms. You heard it too? Walter nodded. Every winter since. He pointed toward the dark tunnel beyond the hidden room. There is another chamber beneath the church, older than the town, older than the logging camps. Thomas discovered it during the search. Ranger suddenly rose to his feet. His entire posture sharpened at once. One paw lifted from the floor. His eyes locked onto the hallway entrance. Cole turned just as a faint golden glow flickered deep within the darkness beyond the tunnel. Not lantern light this time. Softer, warmer, almost alive. Walter slowly stood from his chair, his face pale beneath the firelight. No, he whispered under his breath. It has never come this close before. The glow drifted nearer through the tunnel, illuminating the rough stone walls in waves of amber light. Cole heard it then. Footsteps, slow and deliberate somewhere beneath the mountain. Ranger did not bark. He simply stared into the darkness with complete stillness while the glow stopped just beyond the edge of the hallway. Then a familiar voice echoed softly through the tunnel. Calm, gentle, impossible. Cole. The sound of his own name echoing through the tunnel froze Cole where he stood. The voice carried the same calm steadiness he remembered from childhood winters beside campfires and fishing lakes long before war and silence hollowed his life apart. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, ears forward, amber eyes reflecting the warm glow drifting through the darkness ahead. Walter looked shaken for the first time since Cole had entered the hidden chamber. His hands trembled slightly against the edge of the table while the old hymn crackled softly through the radio beside the stove. That cannot be, Walter whispered under his breath. The glow moved again, slowly brightening the tunnel walls in waves of gold. Cole felt his heartbeat rising hard inside his chest. Every instinct told him to step back, yet something deeper pulled him forward through the fear. He took one careful step toward the hallway. Ranger immediately moved beside him without hesitation. The air grew warmer the farther they entered the tunnel. Stone walls curved naturally around them, threaded with roots that twisted through the ceiling like dark veins beneath ice. The faint singing from below returned once more, softer now, blending with the distant sound of wind moving somewhere deep underground. Cole tightened his grip on the lantern as the passage finally widened into another cavern hidden beneath the mountain. His breath caught quietly. The chamber looked almost sacred. Massive stone pillars rose toward the darkness overhead, while hundreds of candles flickered along the walls inside glass lanterns untouched by dust. At the center of the cavern stood the shattered remains of an old wooden chapel buried beneath the ridge decades earlier. Snowmelt dripped slowly through cracks in the ceiling above, falling like silver rain onto the ruined pews below. Yet what stopped Cole cold was the figure standing near the broken altar. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an old forest ranger coat faded by time. Ranger let out a soft whine and lowered his head gently. The man turned slowly toward them. His face looked younger than memory allowed, untouched by age in ways that made the moment feel impossible. Thomas Mercer's gray eyes met his son's with quiet warmth. Cole could not breathe for several seconds. "Dad," the word barely escaped him. The figure smiled faintly. "You came farther than I hoped you would." Cole stared at him in disbelief. Every rational thought inside his mind fractured beneath the sight standing before him. "You are dead." Thomas glanced around the buried chapel, candlelight reflecting softly across the ancient stone. "Some parts of me are." Ranger stepped forward first. The German shepherd approached the figure carefully before sitting beside him without fear. Thomas rested one hand gently against the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered softly. Still listening, Cole felt tears burn unexpectedly behind his eyes. He had spent most of his life angry at a ghost. Angry at a father who never came home. Angry at silence that never explained itself. Now that silence stood before him wrapped in warm candlelight beneath a mountain that seemed to remember everything. "Why did you stay here?" Cole finally asked. Thomas looked toward the shattered chapel around them. "Because people were trapped beneath the collapse. Some survived longer than anyone believed possible." His voice remained calm, almost peaceful. "Walter and I found them inside these caverns. Families, children, travelers caught in the storm." Cole glanced around the cavern again and suddenly noticed the carvings covering the stone walls. Hundreds of names etched carefully into the rock beside tiny crosses and dates. Thomas followed his gaze. The mountain kept them safe until help came. The air shifted gently through the chamber then, carrying the scent of pine and winter snow. Thomas stepped closer to Cole and slowly removed something from inside his ranger coat. An old compass, worn silver edges scratched with age. Cole recognized it instantly. His father had carried it everywhere. Thomas placed it carefully into his son's trembling hand. "You were never abandoned, Cole," he said softly. "The forest only needed someone patient enough to hear the truth." Then the candles flickered violently all at once. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the ceiling above. Somewhere far overhead, the mountain groaned beneath the weight of shifting ice and snow. The deep groan rolling through the mountain faded slowly into silence, while dust drifted from the cavern's ceiling like pale smoke. Candle flames trembled along the ruined chapel walls, bending softly in the shifting air. Cole tightened his hand around the old silver compass, while Ranger moved closer beside him, pressing against his leg as though grounding him in a moment that no longer felt entirely real. Across the buried chapel, Thomas Mercer stood beneath the warm lantern glow with the same calm expression Cole remembered from childhood mornings beside frozen lakes and pine forests long before life became something heavy to survive. Yet there was sadness in his eyes now too, the kind carried by people who had stayed too long between memory and goodbye. "The ridge is changing again," Thomas said quietly. "Winter always wakes what was left unfinished here." Cole glanced upward as another faint tremor passed through the stone overhead. "Then we need to leave." Thomas smiled gently and shook his head once. "You can leave. I cannot." The words settled heavily inside the cavern. Ranger lifted his head toward Thomas and gave a soft whine almost too quiet to hear. Thomas crouched slowly beside the shepherd and rested both hands against the dog's thick fur. "You brought him here for a reason," he whispered. "Dogs know how to guide wounded souls home." Cole looked down at the compass in his hand. The needle no longer spun wildly like before. It pointed steadily now toward the staircase leading back beneath the cabin. "Why me?" he asked softly. "After all these years, why now?" Thomas rose carefully to his feet and looked around the hidden chapel buried beneath the mountain. Candlelight reflected across the names carved into the stone walls, hundreds of lives remembered quietly beneath snow and silence. "Because grief can become a forest of its own," he said, "and you have been lost inside yours long enough." The old hymn drifting through the cavern began to fade as warm air moved gently through the ruined pews. Somewhere above them, the storm outside had finally begun to weaken. Cole noticed droplets of snowmelt falling slower now from the cracked ceiling overhead. Winter itself seemed to be loosening its grip on the ridge. Thomas stepped backward toward the altar. The glow surrounding him softened with every step, blending slowly into the candlelight around the chapel ruins. "Wait," Cole said quickly. There is still so much I do not understand. Thomas looked at him one final time, his gray eyes steady and peaceful. You do not need to understand everything to know you were loved. The words broke something open quietly inside Cole that years of silence and war had failed to touch. Tears blurred his vision before he could stop them. Ranger leaned gently against him as though he understood exactly what was healing in that moment beneath the mountain. Then the candles flickered once more. The warm glow surrounding the altar faded slowly into darkness until only the empty, ruined chapel remained. Thomas Mercer was gone. Silence settled over the cavern again, but this time it no longer felt lonely. Cole stood motionless for several seconds before Walter's voice echoed faintly from the tunnel behind them. The mountain only keeps souls who still believe they failed someone, the old man said softly. Your father stayed because he could not bear leaving people behind. But tonight the forest finally let him rest. Weeks later, winter began retreating from Ashmorn Ridge. Snow melted slowly along the creek beside the cabin, while sunlight returned to the pines in pale gold ribbons each morning. Cole repaired the old cabin roof, restored the hidden chamber beneath the floor, and reopened the forgotten trails leading toward the ridge. Travelers passing through the mountains soon discovered a small lantern burning outside the cabin every night beside a wooden sign that read "Safe Shelter Ahead." Ranger still watched the forest sometimes after dark, sitting quietly beneath the porch light with his ears lifted toward the trees. But now his tail moved gently whenever the wind carried through the pines. And on certain quiet nights, when the mountain air turned still and silver beneath the stars, Cole could hear faint church bells drifting somewhere deep within the forest, soft and peaceful like a memory finally finding its way home.